Here, for those who can see, Dallas Cowboy socks. And I want to tell you a little bit about my story, and I want to share a little bit about the hope that I have for our church and for the great things that the Lord is doing, not only in Australia, but I see that happening here in the United States, and I see it happening in Europe and all around the world. I grew up in a very poor household, and I came from very humble beginnings where my dad worked in a factory, and we had, I grew up in government housing where we had 8 children in our family, and we only had a 2-bedroom house. And Mum and Dad kept one of those bedrooms for themselves, so they can only be blamed for having 8 children. Nevertheless, myself and 3 of my brothers slept in the garage eventually, and the car got relegated to the street. So that gave us an extra bedroom. But one of the things that happened was we couldn't afford to finish high school. So the key was that all of our children, once we got to sophomore year of high school, we had to get out and get a job and start bringing in some income to help the family. And so I actually got into my head this idea that I saw how hard my dad worked and how much struggle there was, and I wanted to have a big family myself. My wife and I only have 7 children. So my dad used to remind me that he actually beat me because Mum and Dad had 8. And I said, it's not a competition, Dad, it's just everything's a competition. But nevertheless, I left school early, and when I joined the army, because I thought if I joined the army, they could help me give me an education. And so I went off to the Australian Armed Forces, and I was very focused and very intentional about being successful. In fact, it was incredibly important to me in everything that I did, and so very quickly in the army, I focused on sport and being really good at sport, and I ended up being on the army cross-country skiing team, biathlon team, where you cross-country ski and rifle shoot, and within 3 to 4 years, I qualified for the Australian team, and I won the Australian championships, the junior championships and the championships. I went to the World Cup and World Championships. I went to New York in 1979, and I was selected to go to the Olympic Games in 1980 to represent my country. So here I was thinking I was at the pinnacle of success, and then I had a motorbike accident which put me in hospital for 5 months. And I watched the Olympics on television. And while I was lying in my hospital bed, I made up my mind that the elite of the Australian Army was the SAS, the Special Air Service. And so I decided that once I was able to recover from my injuries, I was going to apply for the SAS. And everyone laughed at me, because I'm only a little bloke, 5'6". If I'm wet, I might be 5'5", but nevertheless, I focused on getting into the regiment, the SAS regiment, and I went through their BUDS course, and I went through their selection process, and out of about 2,000 people that originally started that course, we had 126 did that program, and out of that 127, out of that 127, 88 pulled themselves off the course, 89 pulled themselves off the course, 12 were failed, and 26 of us got in. So there I was, very focused on being successful. And then within the regiment, they started up a counter-terrorism team because of what had happened in, there was a lot of PLO terrorism going on. There was a terrorist attack in Sydney, and so the government decided to set up counter-terrorism task force, and I was selected as one of the soldiers to be in the counter-terrorism unit. And so we were considered the elite, and we were very focused on what was going on. One of the other things that we would do is when we're doing the war exercises, we go out to the desert for 5 or 6 weeks, and we'd be living out in the desert in a small patrol. And what had happened was I received a payout from the Traffic Accident Commission for loss of enjoyment of life for missing out on the Olympics. and I was given about $13,000 from insurance payout. In 1980, that was a lot of money. You could buy a brand new car for $6,000 in 1980 in Australia. So it was more money than I'd ever dreamed possible. And so I didn't know what to do with it. So I started applying my intellect and my focus on how could I be really successful with this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity of having all this money. And so I actually started researching how to invest. And so it was a pretty weird jump, to go from being in the military and then to go across and then to be involved in the financial services sector, which is the next thing that I did. But one of the things that led me to that was that I found that I was really fascinated with investment. And I was reading about this fellow called Warren Buffett, who was this big investor. And the fellow who taught him was a fellow called Benjamin Graham, I think, yeah. And so he wrote a book called The Intelligent Investor. He was a professor at Columbia University. And so he'd written this book, The Intelligent Investor. So I decided when I was going on this exercise out into the bush that you could only carry one book with you. We'd take the cover off the book and just take the book because it was heavy to carry anything more than one book. And you have hours and hours and hours where you just had nothing to do but just be lying up while someone was on watch. And so every guy who would take a book with them was always recommended to take a book to read. And then they would take a Wilbur Smith book or a Leon Uris book. At the time when I took The Intelligent Investor, and after I read it once and then read it twice, people started saying that they would swap books, and then everyone was swapping books between each other, but no one wanted my book. So I read this thing about 18 or 20 times, as there was nothing else to read, and I actually fell in love with investing. And we'd only just got rid of exchange controls in Australia. So I started applying these principles not only to investing in Australia, but investing in stocks in America and in Japan. And over the next 4 or 5 years, I ended up quadrupling my money. So that money that I received as a payout had now grown, and I was investing more and more money, and as I was saving a big part of everything that I was earning. Instead of spending it, I was just saving it, and then I was able to buy my first home at 26 years of age for cash. And no one that I knew had been able to do this. And I continued with my investments, and the broker that I was dealing with, I kept on asking if they could change the broker, because every time they gave me a recommendation, I'd research anything they recommended and they'd come up with a whole host of questions. And so I was called the client from hell. No one wanted to deal with me. So the actual fellow in charge of the organisation offered me a job. I said, I'm not qualified. He says, oh, we can train you up, don't worry. And so in 1986, I left the army and I got involved in an investment career. And I found that I was really good at it, and I was very focused, and I'd stay up every night till about 3 o'clock in the morning reading everything I could get my hands on and studying. And so I was very, very focused on being successful. And it was really important to me to make as much money as possible, as it had been important to me to be really at the peak of my sporting career, or to be at the peak of my military career. But everything was focused on being very, very successful. But the thing that I wanted to be most successful at was finding a gorgeous Catholic girl to marry and to start a family. And so I started really researching how to get the most gorgeous, good-looking Catholic girls. And so I started hanging out with other Catholic families that I thought were really devout because they'd have daughters, you see. So I was very systematic about it, and I ended up meeting my beautiful wife, Grace, and we got married and started a family. We got very involved in our faith. I was very involved. We got involved in marriage preparation courses to run courses for other couples in our parish, and we started running it in our diocese. We then got very involved in our local school, and that was attached to the parish where we were, and we were on the school board. And then I got very involved with other aspects. Christopher West came out to Australia, and he had the theology of the body. And so we started getting involved with these theology of the body courses. My wife was very, very passionate about sharing that good news of John Paul II. And so we were involved in lots of different things all the time. but I was very focused, particularly on my career and building up my own business. I was the state manager by the time I was 27 or 28 of the organisation. They moved me from Perth over to Melbourne, and I was literally at 27, 28 years of age managing a whole team of people. So I was one of the youngest managers in the country. And then what happened was I started getting involved with the focus that the Timorese, there was a Timorese, Timor is a little country to the north of Australia, and they had been invaded by Indonesia in 1975, and so I was fighting for their independence and acting in any way I could, writing letters to parliamentarians, and then eventually in 1999 they actually were given their independence, and I was asked by the Timorese government to be their first honorary consul general for them in Australia, and I represented them for the next 13 years in Australia, and talking with the politicians and representing them. And then they asked me to set up their sovereign wealth fund because I've been involved, and I was very heavily involved in the advice profession. And as Howard mentioned, I was on radio. I was speaking all around the world. I received an Order of Australia for services to Australia, and so I was really at the pinnacle of everything that was going on. And I had this wonderful marriage with 7 kids, beautiful wife, involved in my parish, involved in the church, involved in everything that came along. And then one day in 2010, my son, who was my eldest son, who was 16 at the time, and he said that he didn't want to go to Mass anymore. That would never happen in this parish. But because of my background, I'm like thinking, that's what you think, young man. As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord, and you are going to Mass. He goes, no, I'm not. I said, oh, yes, you are. And then we clashed. And my wife was mortified about the falling out that we were having, because he was determined. Because what had happened over the last 30 or 40 years in Australia is people had left the church in droves. In America, about 1 in 5 baptized Catholics still go to Mass on Sunday. 20%. In Australia, it's about 80%. 92% of baptized Catholics have decided that it's not worthwhile. The secular culture has been so toxic that it has been stealing our children away from us, and people have just dropped away. That there wasn't any, real incentive. I was just in Montreal in Quebec just last week, and in Quebec, there's 4% of the population go to Mass on Sunday. Where the oratory of St. Joseph is, it used to be the most Catholic part of North America, where overwhelmingly everyone was Catholic, and now 4%, according to all the surveys, go to Mass only once a month. So the number that go every week is even less, and the number that are really committed to their faith is even less. In Europe, it's like that, but something is happening around the world at the moment. But this was the state of affairs in 2010, when my son said he didn't want to go to Mass anymore. And I thought that I could force him to go to Mass. And basically, we had this huge tussle. And then one time, when he wasn't coming along with the family, we went to Mass, and the priest read, not the Sunday reading this Sunday, which was that you can't serve 2 masters, you can't serve God and mammon. But it was another reading. It was about a rich young man that had actually followed the commandments, and he went along to Jesus and said to Jesus, what must I do to enter the kingdom of heaven? And he said, well, you need to follow the commandments, you need to do this, you need to do that. He goes, tick, 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 tick. I've done all those things. And then, but Jesus looked at him with a look of love and says, well, then sell all you have and come follow me. I believe it was asking Jesus to be an apostle. Can you imagine if you or I were asked to be 1 to 12? And what happened was that man went away sad because he had a lot of money. And that struck me, it hit me right in the heart. That all my life I've been striving to be successful. And here it was when my son wasn't even coming to Mass with us. And I thought, I didn't know what to do to get him to actually come to Mass. My wife was distraught, like St. Monica, who prayed for 28 years for her son Augustine. And so I was really struck by that gospel. I thought, could I do that? Could I do that? And then the priest gave the homily. And the priest that gave the homily said, we didn't really mean to sell all you have. What he meant was just, just have an attitude of, and I got really angry. It just boiled up in me because I thought he was watering down the words of Jesus. And that's what I had been seeing in Australia for decades and decades prior to this. And that's why my son wasn't going to church anymore, because he didn't have anything to inspire him, because we were uninspiring. And it was all the priest's fault. It's always good to blame father, isn't it? But when I point the finger at someone, usually I've got another 3 or 4 fingers pointing back at me. And so on the way home, I was still seething with anger at the priest. And then I was telling my wife, this is terrible, She goes, you're not angry at the priest, you're angry at yourself. Ooh. And so I had to think about that. It wasn't very much later that we had 4 or 5 of our very close friends come around for dinner. And they were very close friends because their sons were in the same class of school as my oldest son. And none of their sons were going to Mass either. In fact, none of the kids in my son's class at school, or none of them were practicing anymore. So that's why I felt it was not cool. And everyone was being impacted by this. No one seemed to worry too much. Oh, it doesn't matter, as long as they're nice people, as long as they're good. And my wife was distraught about all of this. But nevertheless, the dinner party conversation got on to what subjects our boys were going to be taking in junior and senior year in high school, so that they could get into the courses at university that would be most suitable. One of the guys started talking about how his son wanted to be a doctor, so he was studying science and he was doing so well, and he was hoping that he was going to get into medicine. And someone else started talking about their son wanted to be a lawyer. And someone else said they were going into business. So as we were going around the table, obviously, I started thinking, well, my son wants to be just like me. He wants to be so successful. And at this stage, I was on the radio, I was the big, I'm writing in newspapers and speaking all over the world on finance, and I felt I'd really made it. I'd actually accumulated tens of millions of dollars, and we had the best of everything, and my son wanted to follow in my footsteps. And before I could open my mouth to say that my son wanted to go into the finance sector, my wife piped up, sitting right next to me. And she said, I don't care if he's a trash collector, as long as I get to spend eternity with him. Oh my goodness. I looked around at her, and all my bravado dropped away as her eyes were welling up in tears about the fact that our son didn't know Jesus, didn't have an encounter, and hadn't had an opportunity to have an encounter with the Lord, and felt that religious practice was just a waste of time. And if our eldest son wasn't going to be practicing, neither were any of his little brothers or sisters. And so they were going to become part of that statistic where 92% of baptized Catholics don't practice anymore. And when I looked at my wife, and my heart broke for her pain that I could see in her eyes, I knew that I had to do something. But not when all her friends went away. What happened was I went for a walk down the street, and I looked up at the stars, and I prayed, God, what do I need to do? I obviously can't force him to go. What can I do? And this was one of those bacon and egg moments. You know about bacon and egg moments here? Bacon and eggs. The chicken's involved, but the pig's committed. I had been involved in my faith, but I wasn't committed to my faith. My son was looking at me and he said he wanted to be just like me in all things, except for he thought my faith practice was something I did on the side. And it wasn't that important. It's like making a decision when you buy a big steak dinner and then they say, would you like corn or mashed potato or fries on the side? And you can actually choose that, but it's going to have the same steak dinner. And so my faith wasn't the main dish. It was just a side issue. And so as I prayed to God, I really got that sense that, the reason my son wasn't practicing, and I know the statistics, that children look to their mother for nurture, but they look to their father for character. Just got to watch these old mafia movies, often the mother is a really devout Catholic, going to mass every day, and the father's out there murdering people. The chances of those children, being like the mum is very low. They might love their mum, but they actually become mafia murderers like their dad. So effectively, if the father deeply practices his faith, there's a chance of about 70 to 80% chance that the kids will follow in his footsteps. Whereas the mother practices the faith but the father doesn't, there's only about a 20% chance. So us men have got to man up. And the reason my son wasn't going wasn't my wife's fault, it was my fault. And so what I did was I said, Lord, I'll do anything. I just wanted to end the pain that was in my wife's heart. And I got a really strong sense that God was saying, hey, let's mess with his head. How about you just sell all you have and give it away and come follow me? Going, oh Lord, that's not fair. But I made the decision that I needed not to just be involved, but I needed to be utterly committed. And my life changed that day, changed forever. And that's what Jesus is calling each and every one of us to literally surrender, to give everything to him. I was always so impressed at our Protestant brothers and sisters who tithe 10%. And most parishes, we give less than 1% to the Lord and think we're giving a bit more than everyone else. And we think we're doing well. 10%, wow. And then I realised that 10% is a lousy tip. The guys these days want a 20% tip. And so tithing is tipping. And so Jesus, he didn't say, let's make it easy. He said, take up your cross and follow me. And when we talked about marriage, Ephesians comes to mind, where Jesus, St. Paul talked in Ephesians how women, submit to your husband, but not just to get his slippers and get his beer. That's not submitting. It's submitting to the vision of marriage that your husband has. And Jesus says to the men, love your bride, love your wife like Christ loved the church. Christ gave everything for his bride, the church. He laid down his life. He's there on the marriage bed of the cross. Marriage is all about sacrifice. And I watched Charlie Kirk's wife, his widow, speaking on Sunday. I was just, and I saw it on television. I was at my friend's place, and I stopped everything when there were all these other people, politicians and boring people getting up and speaking. But then when Erica Kirk got up and spoke, and she spoke about how she forgave the person who murdered her husband. And because that's what Christ asked us to do, and that's what he did. Say on the cross was, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And she said that's what Charlie would want. And she also talked about how Charlie, her husband, every day would say, how can I be a better husband? How can I serve you better? And how can I sacrifice what's in it for me to be, what can I do to be a better husband for you? And so marriage is about sacrifice and putting someone else first. And so Jesus talks about taking up your cross and following him. And so there's a cost involved. And so I'm just watching the time because I don't want to go too much over, otherwise my friends will get mad at me. But what happened was I started surrendering everything to God. And the first $1,000 was really hard to give away. But then I give it away and then I try to pull it back. But then gradually, God just softened my heart and allowed me to be involved in so many ministries. Divine Renovation, which is basically bringing the heart of the gospel. It's bringing hope to priests, life to parishes and people to Jesus. And we're now working with 450 parishes across Australia and New Zealand. I'm involved in the global ministry. I'm involved in the Apostles Fund, where we've established a ministry which is about supporting other ministries, where our fruit grows on other people's trees. But we're pouring into resources and expertise into helping ministries that are bringing people to Christ, so that they can actually have an encounter with Christ. And what I'm seeing, not just from the work we're doing, because we can't convert anybody, the Holy Spirit does that, but I'm finding so many other people. I met Charbel at Parish, and I'm doing this sort of work. I've met Deacon Harold, he's staying in our home, and we just had 2 weeks ago Dr. Edward Shree visiting us and getting super excited about the kangaroos that we're eating on our front garden. And I'm thinking they're just pesky kangaroos that eat the plants. And he's like, I've got to take photos. But it's been quite an extraordinary journey where I've ended up meeting some of the most extraordinary people I've ever been blessed to come into contact with. And my life has become filled with joy and filled with promise. And it's been so exciting. It's been a great daring adventure. As Helen Keller said, life is a daring adventure or nothing at all. And she was deaf, dumb and blind. And so what's happened is God has transformed my life. And there is so much work to be done. And so from that day when I looked up into the heavens and prayed to Jesus, I haven't earned a cent. I've been just giving it away. And my kids know they're not going to inherit anything, because by the time I'm gone, it's got to be all given away. I've kept a few investments and they keep going up and doubling and tripling in value. And so I can't give it away fast enough. But then what happened was, one of my investments, they asked me to be on the chairman of the board, and I thought I just need to do it for a couple of years. And my wife goes, you're going back over to the dark side. You're just having too much fun making money. And I think, okay. So, what's happening is I've actually got this incredible life that God has blessed me with. And I'm seeing all sorts of things happening. I spoke to, in February, 2 priests from the parish of Toulouse in France. And France is got really bad statistics. But just this year, there's been something like 2,000 people came for adult baptism. And in this parish, these 2 priests, they told me that 3 weeks before at Easter, they had 184 people came for baptism. Half of them were Muslims. And it's extraordinary. And they said that this year I should come back next April at Easter, because they've got 250 in their catechumenate program. And in Canada, I was seeing parishes where there was one parish I visited just a week ago, and there were less than 50 people left in the pews 3 years ago. And the parish priest from a neighbouring parish said his first fruits. He asked the 10 best families in his parish to leave his parish and go and support his brother priest in his neighbouring parish and help to renew their parish. And now they've got 400 or 500 people in that parish, and they're sending people out to another parish to actually help other parishes, so that the church is coming alive again in Quebec. And so I'm seeing things happening left, right and centre. I'll leave Texas next Tuesday, and I'll fly to New Zealand, where we've got 500 people at a big conference, which one of my friends, a bishop there in New Plymouth, has called together this big conference to talk about parish renewal. So all things are possible. The Holy Spirit is moving. Aslan is on the move. And it is such a great joy to be part of this incredible renewal that's happening in our church. And I'm sure that it can happen here, and that the way that Deacon Harold asked us to come and to share some of our stories, to really encourage you to know that you're not alone and that there is such an opportunity. The parish is the only club in town here in Lockhart that exists for its non-members. The ship of the parish is not a cruise ship where you get served, where you get Father and everyone else going to provide things for you. It's a battleship. Everyone's got a job. Everyone's got a task to do. And until all souls come to Christ, all the lost and the lonely come to Christ, until that happens, our task is not done. It's not about just going to Mass or coming to daily Mass. You know, there's lots of people here, but sometimes I go to daily Mass in Australia, there's only about 15 people, but they're spread right throughout the entire church. I think they learned the social distance before COVID even came along. But the fact is that we need to be worrying about our own piety and our own faith, but we need, unless we share it with others, then, you know, it's not alive, and it's not doing what it needs to be doing. And so I encourage you all to continue to share the faith and to make a difference. And God, this is what puts a smile on God's heart, because He loves the people who are lost and lonely, and He would leave the 99 sheep to find the lost sheep. These days He's leaving the one sheep and trying to find the 99. But the harvest is plentiful, the labourers are few. Please get out there into the labour and make a difference. Thank you very much.